I suspect this video is going to be a bit controversial. Much of it is devoted to picking apart some very coveted pieces of pop culture lore in respect to Japanese martial arts. These things include the supposed Bujutsu and Budo evolution and dichotomy, samurai duels, dojo storming, the supposed Japaneseness of some of the central philosophies related to modern Budo, and why the Western conceptualization of a martial art quote-unquote working largely misses the point of Japanese martial traditions altogether, both historical and modern. As a result of this expectation for controversy, I've approached this project with a level of intensity that I normally just would not. The first way this has affected the video is with editing. I've committed mostly to the bare bones, distilled main points here to make a lot of information as succinct and digestible as possible. I have cut a lot of fat out of this video. As for sourcing, direct quotes and just passages that I otherwise use will be put on screen along with a note communicating where they originate from. I encourage viewers to pause and read these excerpts as they appear. At the end of the video, I'm going to have a whole sources section. I'm going to discuss the sources that I think are a must-read, at least in terms of relating to this video, and the reading order that I would find to be most useful for you. I will also list some extra readings there for context. These extra readings were used in the making of this video, but don't form the spine of the argument. They simply provide useful background information and put ideas into a historical setting. To be clear, if you're just watching this for some light edutainment, the sources section can absolutely be skipped. I've included it partially for people who want to trace this rabbit hole as I have, but also because I expect there will be a crowd that won't like the contents forthcoming. Although my channel is not massive, I simply don't have the time nor the interest to re-explain the whole thesis to people in the comments. I enjoy very much interacting with my audience, but engaging with individuals whose arguments boil down to "nuh-uh" is frankly just poor allocation of my time. Time I could be using to train or study or make you guys better content. I'm more than happy to debate or be proven wrong, but that must start with understanding my argument and refuting the premises within my core sources. I'm unimpressed with the uncorroborated folk histories of your sensei, the one-off anecdote of a self-defense situation that happened to you 20 years ago, or the clumsily devised fan fiction that supposedly reflects the beliefs of an art's founders. These takes are a dime a dozen. Trust me, I've seen and heard them all. Good information is more accessible than ever before. Martial arts and its myriad practitioners deserve better than a constant cycle of dubious bro science and flimsy histories. Pop culture can be fun. I enjoy a good myth, a good story, as much as the next guy. But we've gotten awfully complacent in regard to accepting certain statements with no further scrutiny. This video is actually part of a double upload, though. A loose companion piece will be coming out alongside this one, and it will be linked at the end of this video. There, I'm going to talk about how studying this stuff has shifted my point of view, what it's doing for my training, and why I think it matters. It's one thing to dump all these sources and stats on you across who knows how many videos at this point, but it's something else to see how this information is actually applied, how it actually affects a person when implemented. Hopefully through my in-practice example, you can choose for yourself if all this stuff is something that ought to matter to you. Finally, I do not ask this much in my content, but I think this video is worth sharing. Send it to your buddies or teachers or even bother other martial arts YouTubers with it if you really want. Obviously, be respectful, don't spam anyone, but I do think this video is for anyone even loosely involved with Japanese martial arts, and they would probably think about things a little bit more deeply after seeing it, or perhaps just reject it outright. But whatever the case, I do think it's information worth sharing around. Anyway, thank you so much, and let's jump on into the meat and potatoes, shall we? If you do Japanese martial arts, you'll almost certainly run into this idea that whatever art you're doing was better before. Before the Olympics, judo was better. Before the war, aikido was more martial. Before the mainland import of karate, it was purer. Before this modern age, the swordsmen of our style really fought. Some of these assertions are even partially correct, but for now I want to direct your attention to just how Japanese the idea of a golden age actually is. The Buddhist position is that the world is in a constant state of decay, implicitly declaring that the past was more ideal. Confucian morality calls individuals to revere their predecessors and ancestors. In some cases, the accomplishments of the dead are more important to the living sense of self than their own achievements. Japanese culture is one that repeatedly appeals to tradition for legitimacy, but tradition isn't necessarily history. In fact, the book Mirror of Modernity: Invented Traditions of Modern Japan, edited by Stephen Vlastos, spends a whole volume establishing this point. The world of martial arts is not immune to this invention of tradition. Most of what has been canonized as truth in popular culture is remarkably uncorroborated. Although it is normal for academic discussion to pull ahead of everyday dojo chatter, I can't really think of another hobby that is so completely divorced from high-level literature. Modern weight training leans heavily into studies. I've even seen hiking YouTubers bring up literature on cardio and nutrition, yet Japanese martial arts history and training seems to exist solely on an attractive yet wobbly pretense of tradition and vibes. Personally, although I can't prove this, I believe most of this mythology persists because practitioners kind of want it to. I think people would rather believe in an idealized myth than a drier yet more honest history. Fictionalization isn't the dominion of this video, though, so let's take a hard look at some of pop culture's favorite hot topics. Let's see if they hold up. Likely to your chagrin, and definitely to mine, I have to begin this list once again by beating a bit of a dead horse. I've gone on this channel discussing that there really isn't a lot of good evidence for Japanese martial arts coming from the battlefield. I'm not really going to deep dive it again here. You can go watch those videos if you want, the most detailed of which is being linked on screen now. I'm also going to throw up some relevant passages from academic studies. Feel free to pause here and read at your leisure. The simple fact is that swordsmanship and certainly unarmed so-called battlefield grappling isn't substantiated by primary sources or archaeology. Likewise, martial arts like archery and sumo were sportified almost as early as written script on the Japanese archipelago. Complete with seasonal tournaments, sponsors, and prizes, these were sports pretty much from the beginning, even if that's not the word they would have been using at the time to describe them. For my longtime viewers, I'm sure hearing me talk about this again is a bit frustrating, but unfortunately, this is where we have to start in many ways, because it is out of this belief that so many other erroneous fictions grow. Point in case, the ideology of Bushido. For most Western commentators, Bushido is a kind of analog to European chivalry that espouses the good virtues of loyalty, bravery, and duty. This notion, as you might have imagined from the theme of this video, is deeply flawed, however. In the first place, the comparisons of Bushido to chivalry, or more broadly, Japanese feudalism to European feudalism, grew out of a pretty racist line of academic rhetoric that has, embarrassingly, been used to characterize a lot of Japanese history in modern pop culture. While this topic alone could probably be a short video unto itself, I will attempt here to speedrun where the idea came from. Basically, in 1905, Japan kicked the absolute tar out of Russia in a war creatively named the Russo-Japanese War. For the English-speaking world of 2024, This event is typically relegated to an obscure footnote, but for the English-speaking world of 1905, it sort of had them pooping their pants a little. From the perspective of the heavily racialized world of 1905, this victory should not have been possible. Japan was a medieval backwater a mere half-century prior, yet here it was, a fully modernized nation in the blink of an eye in terms of geopolitical timescales. Not only was it fully modernized, but it arguably had the best navy in the world at the time and defeated a long-established imperial power. All of these feats were wildly unprecedented, yet what the enlightened academic West instead chose to focus on was how Asians could have done this. You see, such a victory and even just modernization alone were considered to be the providence of white people. The thought was that such accomplishments came from a racial, ethnic, and cultural spirit exclusive to Western societies. Rather than question the ingrained prejudices they had, Western scholarship instead set out to prove that the Japanese were actually secretly pretty white, the token white guys of Asia, in fact. The narrative that was settled on was that Japan had achieved all it had because actually Japanese feudalism, values, and culture had an uncanny similarity to European counterparts. Post-World War II scholarship wisened up to this nonsense, and now most scholars worth their salt would not be caught dead making such superficial comparisons. Pop culture, on the other hand, has never really outgrown this. While it is innocently unaware of the racially motivated origins of this thinking, it is certainly addicted to its simplicity. And indeed, there is a certain kind of utility in explaining Bushido or the Japanese land system as vaguely analogs to Europe's. As a super cursory introduction to these ideas, I don't think it's necessarily harmful, but it is self-defeating when it becomes such an immutable feature of the layman understanding such as it has. I do need to briefly take an aside here and point out that in 1905, scholars and politicians alike were bending over backwards, arguably doing academic malpractice, to prove that Western culture and Japanese culture were actually super similar, almost exactly alike. The Japanese were just like us. That explains how they became so powerful so quickly. And then, a short 35 and some change years later, they were doing the exact opposite, pushing out propaganda showing how they were nothing like us. It is very important to understand and recognize when there is propaganda afoot. That's true in everyday life. It's true in martial arts. Always read things deeply and make sure that you understand the timeline, because these things become grossly self-evident if you pay attention. Anyway, I don't want to go much farther down this side story. What I will say is that when American President Woodrow Wilson was devising the League of Nations, he and his peers decided Japan should be a part of this league, but at the same time doubled down on the idea that the Japanese race would never be equal to their white counterparts. Japan's modernization, international delegations, and cultural charm offensive up until that point had been mostly to try and earn that position of equality on the international stage. This, though, was a turning point. A growing ethnocentric pan-Asianist nationalism was already maturing in Japan, and this final rejection only accelerated it. Japan began to interpret its continued denial of equality differently. Rather than being because it lacked modernization or lacked military power, it understood its rejection was primarily on racial grounds. Therefore, it twisted this narrative into one that suggested its achievements were due to ethnic exceptionalism, that the West not accepting them as equals was not because they looked down on them so much as they were afraid of a rising power. And honestly, Japan's analysis might have been correct. I do think the West was likely afraid of Japanese power on the rise, but nevertheless, even though their analysis probably had some truth to it, this was the narrative that set Japan on the path to nightmarish war crimes. They would do things to people that have scarcely been done in history. Truly horrific, evil stuff. All I'm pointing out here is that both sides had their fair share of stupid belief systems going around. Of course, the irony here is that this kind of exceptionalism was something that Japan and the West shared. The exceptionalist idea is what drove both to these extreme polar positions and would eventually set them on a war path. I just want to point out one more dimension to this whole thing, mostly to break the idea that the West really wasn't doing anything wrong, because a lot of time Western history is pruned of these troublesome issues. I want to point out that the League of Nations allowed Japan to continue to hold its Chinese colonies in order to get them on board for the League of Nations project. Prior to this announcement, Woodrow Wilson had been spreading the ideals of self-determination and equality among nations. This earned him many fans in China, yet when he then went along with allowing Japan to keep its colonies, it was viewed justifiably as a hypocritical stab in the back in China. One of Wilson's largest admirers turned betrayed critic in this exchange was a young man named Mao. How things might have been different. I'm not telling you this to demonize the West retroactively or to imply that modern China or Imperial Japan were or are somehow saints. From a dark humor kind of angle, I'm not sure so many nations have ever made so many diplomatic fumbles all at once as they did in the aftermath of World War I. The road to hell is truly paved with good intentions. Yet, as a historian, I do believe it is amateurish malpractice to project contemporary values back into the past. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that the West, especially the American-led West, has never really had a great understanding of East Asia, even at the highest levels. So it isn't that surprising that the layman's image of something like Japanese martial arts is less configured by a functional understanding of Japanese history, culture, and philosophy, but rather by archaic comparisons, poorly conceived anecdotes, and fantasies one-sidedly imposed and reinforced by popular culture. That was a lot of context and a long way to go just to take the piss out of the idea that Bushido is somehow a quote-unquote Japanese chivalric code. The extra layer on this, though, however, is that most modern Japanese people misunderstand it too. Even here, in the country of its origin, Bushido is popularly thought of as more or less a chivalric code. The historical reality is much different, of course. Samurai loyalty was very much a commodity to be bought and maintained. We see far more samurai switching sides mid-battle in the historical record than we do them stalwartly fighting to the death in the name of fealty to a lord. While any type of soldiering requires some bravery, samurai retreat wasn't that uncommon either. And as for duty, again, this was a service a retainer provided for a tangible gain, not some kind of spiritual or cultural principle. Before I get into how Bushido got so corrupted and evolved into its modern-day form, I need to talk about the guy who more or less invented it. In the opening lines of the Hagakure, Yamamoto Tsunetomo pens, "I have found the way of the warrior is to die." No other work contributed to Bushido more than the Hagakure. I have to direct your attention now to a curiosity in the timeline of this philosophical treatise. Keep in mind the Hagakure is principally concerned with how a samurai should comport himself as defined by his warrior class status. Tsunetomo got most of his content from conversations with one Nabeshima Mitsushige, his former boss, which he later distilled down into teachings. These were later compiled and published some years later by one of Tsunetomo's students. Here is the troubling bit. Nabeshima was born in 1632. Tsunetomo himself was born in 1659. The last major battle prior to the shogunate's era of national peace was the Battle of Sekigahara, which took place in 1600. So, in other words, the Hagakure, which provides the philosophical base for Bushido, was conceived by a man who never fought in a battle, talking to another man who also never fought in a battle. Not only does Bushido not reflect samurai behaviors historically, but it was invented after the warrior age of the samurai class. In fact, as best we can tell, the Hagakure's author was kind of regarded as a bit of a madman in his own time for these errant beliefs. How do we go from a man whose historical fan fiction ideology was more or less discarded in his own time to today's almost glorification of Bushido, though? Remember how I said the West's academic circles were doing some serious mental gymnastics to accommodate how it was possible that Japan could rise so quickly? Well, the Japanese were up to their own questionable scholarship. When the ultra-nationalist militarists pulled Bushido and the Hagakure from the dustbin of historical rejects, they couldn't have cared less about its truthful historical value, if it even has any of that. What they saw instead was a great ideological framework to indoctrinate young men into never surrendering and flying planes into enemy warships. And thus, it was used in the name of violence. After the war, Bushido was toned down, but its fictional association with the samurai of the past never vanished, and therefore some inklings of it have bled into the philosophical ideals of Japanese martial arts systems. At this point, you might be feeling a bit let down. So far, I've discussed that Japanese martial arts did not originate from the battlefield, and that Bushido does not reflect a historical reality, despite being a parent of so much martial arts philosophy. I have bad news, though, because we have more pop culture hot topics to take shots at. Let's briefly consider duels and dojo storming for a minute. In English-speaking discussion, these are usually considered events that were used to prove oneself or one style superior to another. There is an element of truth to this. Sometimes duels and dojo storming had a dimension to them which included vendettas or were about taking over a local martial arts economy. More times than not, though, these things were only superficially so intense. Something that people need to understand about duels in Japan is that deaths weren't all that common in them. Yes, the fight was almost always assumed to be to the death, but the reason why samurai like Musashi, for example, stand out so much is that he disregarded dueling convention and generally pissed people off, and he was a prolific killer. Funny enough, though, even Musashi let people go sometimes. In the founding myth of Shinto Muso Ryu, for example, Musashi defeats Muso Gonosuke Katsuyoshi, but the defeated is allowed to just walk away. He slinks down to Kyushu only to train up and finally defeat Musashi at a later date. Now, some of you might know that this story really isn't corroborated by any historical evidence. I'm kind of a stickler for sources, so this might feel out of place for one of my videos. I find this is a valid enough example, though, for two reasons. First, this was a legend relatively contemporary to these guys' own times. What this means is that even if it were a complete fabrication, it had to be believable enough to audiences. The fact that no one seems to question that Gonosuke was allowed to just leave tells us that it was pretty commonplace. Second, Konosuke was defeated pretty badly by Musashi. Like, he got his butt kicked with the lid of a pot in some versions. I've read a lot of these kinds of myths, and this one stands out to me because the protagonist isn't presented as some kind of sage warrior who reaches enlightenment. Instead, it depicts the founder of a style, usually the subject of almost cultish exaltation, getting humiliated. This doesn't mean that this really happened, but the frankness of the story has always lent it some credence. Why did samurai just let their opponents go, though? The thing people don't really understand about duels, and to a certain extent dojo storming, is that they were originally part of a process called Musha Shugyo. The Musha Shugyo was a journey warriors undertook to perfect their martial craft and reach a type of enlightenment. In some respects, it's almost pseudo-religious in nature, a martial pilgrimage. I want you to keep this in mind because Musha Shugyo as a means of self-improvement is a theme that will return later in the video. For now, though, just remember that the goal of these journeys was not to just massacre everyone you fought. Yeah, some people might die and some people might earn a duelist's anger, but in many ways, dueling was kind of like exchanging business cards. The goal here was not mere self-improvement, but to build a reputation which could then be used to market yourself to a lord in order to become his teacher or retainer or both. If you lost to a duelist, you might become his student, investing in the possibility that his becoming a retainer would be a connection you could use to secure yourself a job. As silly as it sounds, dueling was networking. And yes, dojo storming was much the same. Certainly, sometimes you wanted to kick someone's butt or snuff out local competition, but a lot of the time, dojo stormers did not make challenges to cause problems. Instead, they'd fight a few guys and then, out of respect, choose not to continue all the way to the master, even if they would win. In this way, the dojo stormer was often given food and board for a few days, and possibly even some training. Again, in a weird roundabout way, this was about making connections. I have to point out here that I've seen modern comments glorifying dojo storming. There's this notion that back then men were men, that martial arts were provable, but keep in mind, even back then, if you beat up a respected member of society, if you beat up some old master, no one's going to want to have a relationship with you. No one's going to want to hire you. Likewise, if you just kill everyone that you meet in a duel, you're not going to build a positive reputation as a team player. Remember, all of this was to get a job. Even in relatively modern times, like the Gracies, when they were dojo storming, it's not really as romantic as people make it out to be. I've talked to some Brazilians and most of them tell me pretty much the same thing. They say that the Gracies were undoubtedly exceptional martial artists, and they were also undoubtedly bullies. These were not good practices if you were just doing them to beat on people. Sure, you might prove that your martial art is better, but it won't take you any further in society. It won't be a good investment in the long term. And indeed, viewed through this lens, Musashi, arguably the most famous Japanese duelist of all time, was actually a bit of a failure. He spent most of his late life trying to get his successors into economically sustainable positions under various lords so he too could reap some of those benefits. Something that he was largely unable to do in his own prime despite his legendary dueling history. At the end of his life, he wandered off to Kyushu, brushed some philosophy, reminisced about the days when martial arts were less fake, and then died alone. I feel there is some tragic poetic comparison to be made here. How many UFC fighters retire and succumb to injuries of the brain, slowly decaying as a prisoner in their own bodies by themselves? Meanwhile, the martial arts movie stars doing all the fake stuff are 5 times richer and have 0 brain damage at all. I'm not making this comparison to argue against martial functionality and training. I'm just pointing out that you could be a UFC champion or the most prolific duelist of your age, but if you can't integrate those achievements into a profession society actually cares about, you'll likely spend your latter years absent-mindedly mumbling about your glory days while not being any better off for all the scars you accumulated during them. As Japan's glory days faded into history, samurai went from soldier to bureaucrat. Martial arts became more businesslike. Philosophy and spiritualism were always wrapped up in training, but now in the Edo period, physical and spiritual cultivation came to the forefront. Here we begin to see the concept of michi, written in the same fashion as the do in Budo, bubble to the surface. Taken from Buddhist, Confucian, and Taoist doctrines, michi, or the way, was now attached not only to martial arts but to sports, fine arts, and religious activity. Although these were all conceptualized as different ways, with a capital W, they all led to the same place. What I want to point out to you here is that we are very much in the Bujutsu era of martial arts development. This is supposed to be the golden age many refer to when they suggest that things were better back then, when martial arts were about fighting, real fighting. Yet here we find the Bujutsu clearly emphasizing self-improvement in the same way modern Budo does, and indeed how Musha Shugyo did before it. In modern configurations of Budo evolution, we tend to suggest that this was a new development, but it was never new. This component was always in the martial arts. It was simply only emphasized more or less during a given era. I also now need to point out how Bujutsu is professionalizing here. Again, the commercialization of martial arts for general audiences is something most attribute to modern Budo, yet here we are in the era of Bujutsu and personal private schools are being developed for the first time. Once again, though, this is not totally new. Recall that the goal of dueling and dojo storming was typically for self-promotion. These were activities for networking and resume building. Martial arts were always about building a career in this case. In the Sengoku period, your profession was soldiering. In the early Tokugawa days, you duel in the hopes of becoming some lord's fencing instructor or retainer. And here in the early Bujutsu era, you would be starting a school. This dimension of professionalism is something so much English language discourse just ignores. Instead, the timeline is configured as presuming martial arts were about soldiering, and then they were about real fighting, and then everything went to shit and got weak. Upon deeper inspection, however, the aims of commercialization and self-betterment were always present across all these eras. Now, there are differences worth noting. For one thing, Budo introduced the idea of teaching dozens, hundreds, and even thousands of students simultaneously. Compare this to Bujutsu even today, which have maybe a couple hundred students globally. There is definitely something to be said about commercialization destroying the quality of training by making it impersonal and expert attention being stretched far too thin. There also was more concern about fighting efficacy in the older days, but consider that Japan was far, far more violent a place than it is today. Modern Japanese people will usually look at you a little funny if you proclaim that your primary reason for studying Budo is self-defense motivated. I also need to take a moment here to look at some of the philosophies that are encapsulated in Budo, specifically Kano Jigoro's philosophy. I'm picking on Kano here because the man is almost single-handedly responsible for the rebranding of Bujutsu into Budo, both opting to name his art Judo and pushing for this renovation through his position in the nation's governing body of martial arts, the Dai Nippon Butokukai, now defunct, long defunct, in fact. Kano is best known for his philosophy of best use of energy and mutual benefit. While his study of this may have begun with Chinese classics, it curiously ended with Western philosophy. Herbert Spencer, a philosopher Kano studied, titled one of his works The Cooperation of Self and Others, which was then translated into Japanese by one of Kano's colleagues and was further slightly altered into Kano's Self and Others Mutually Benefit. Of course, this genealogy isn't only title deep. A comparison of Kano's work to Spencer's reveals a clear connection, not to mention that Japan was undergoing a bit of a Spencer boom during Kano's time. As for Kano's ideas on use of energy, the inspiration here begins with the old adage that soft overcomes hard, but really takes its final form under the concept of energism via German chemist Wilhelm Ostwald. It comes complete with such catchy phrases as "do not waste energy, utilize it." I could deep dive these each, but I'm trying to draw these connections only in broad strokes. The takeaway here is that some of Budo's most prized philosophical revelations are the result of a dialogue with Western thinkers, and in some ways are lifted directly from them. Kano's philosophy, at the very least, is a synthesis of Confucian classical knowledge and early 20th century European philosophy. But what am I getting at with all this? What is the point of this video, really? What I'm illustrating for you here is that Budo is not purely Japanese, and those golden ages of martial arts past are not so cut and dry. The idea that martial arts came from the battlefield and Bushido itself are both historically unsubstantiated. The notion that we generate this clean timeline of samurai as soldiers, and then Bujutsu and or early Budo as fighting, and then Budo as when things went awry just isn't all that sustainable either. Martial arts training was always about self-improvement. It was always about sport. It was always adjacent to fine art, and it was always about building a career. Beyond that, most of these developments only occurred because of a dialogue with the West. Bujutsu fell out of style and necessitated the repackaging of curriculums into Budo because the Meiji Restoration's cultural shift caused Budo to fall out of favor with the general public. The Meiji Restoration happened primarily because Commodore Perry showed up and forced Japan to open to the world. Bushido happened, in some ways, because the West couldn't get over the fact that the Japanese were Asian. Budo's subsequent development into a primarily physical fitness activity with spiritual undertones was largely because of the post-war American occupiers banning martial arts briefly, and Japan, as part of a larger cultural strategy motivated by these kinds of moves by the Americans, decided to rebrand itself as East Asia's peaceful neighbor. And of course, none of that is to mention how much early 19th century Western philosophy has influenced Budo either. This is all important because perhaps in the tradition of Woodrow Wilson, Westerners still largely don't get it. We instead have this tendency to cram the remarkably consistent evolution of Japanese martial arts into these disjointed, self-serving narrative categories. The perceived faults of modern Budo are often laid at the feet of the Japanese, while we completely ignore our own Western role in it. But I think most of all, people are just wrong when they say this or that Budo style doesn't work. I'll speak of the American perspective here because that's where I come from. In the States, martial arts are basically asocial private affairs, and I mean this historically too. From the Wild West duels to the Hatfield-McCoy feud, person-to-person violence has almost always been outside the purview of both society and the law. Outside of some niche positions like police work or being a bouncer and naturally being a professional fighter, there are very few things you can get paid to do in respect to your training. I want you to consider the Second Amendment for a moment. The language is that of authorization for the people to bear arms. This is the state saying that yes, you may carry firearms if you wish. Compare this to Japan's Bukkei Shohato, promulgated in 1650, which outlines 6 state-recognized martial traditions: swordsmanship, gunnery, jujitsu, spearmanship, horse riding, and archery. Unlike the Second Amendment, which communicates an authorization to general citizens, the Bukkei Shohato communicates expectations to samurai specifically. This is super important. The American law is saying, sure, you may use firearms if you want. You probably should if you're in the frontier or whatever, but it's down to you. The Japanese law was saying, here are 6 martial traditions, and we expect you to be good at them. It is what makes you of the samurai class. This distinction is very clear. Martial arts in America, be they old-timey marksmanship or modern MMA, are niche and a subculture. They are arguably a counterculture in many ways. By contrast, martial arts in Japan are an accepted part of the culture. They always have been. At first, perhaps, they were designated by class, aimed specifically at the samurai alone, but even back then, society and the law had provisions to accommodate their martial nature more broadly. Fast forward until today, and martial arts in Japan are subsidized like crazy by the government. Martial arts clubs in university are about preparation for the workforce and networking with alumni who are already in the labor force, and you can work for a company as something like a judoka, for example. This matters because when an American asks if a martial art works or not, he is almost necessarily asking about fighting. He is asking about if he can personally and privately impose violence on another person if needed using a martial art as a tool. This is not how things function in Japan, not historically and not now. If you asked if a martial art worked here, you'd likely need to be more specific because that question can be interpreted in so many ways. Fighting some dude on the off chance of a confrontation is maybe a fourth or fifth thing on someone's mind. A martial art quote-unquote working in Japan might mean you can make a living on it, that it has made you more fit or a better critical thinker or made you better connections that you have built a profession off of. And what I need to stress is that it isn't wrong to see martial arts this way. Judging a martial tradition's value along these lines has, as this video has demonstrated, deep historical precedence in Japan. I know there is an urge for some users to just say it's martial arts. Fighting is in the name. But this is just being like those old scholars who couldn't believe that Japan has a particular way of doing things that works specifically for them and produces results on par with our own. It is one-sidedly imposing a familiar point of view on a foreign place, an exercise in trying to impose one's personal biases on a culture that needs to be understood on its own terms. I stress these things not to put anyone under fire. I think it's pretty natural for people to hunger for the things their culture values, and in America, we see a martial art for what it's always been to us: self-defense. Well, self-defense unless you work in one of those niche professions or are just a straight-up criminal. Nor am I saying that the evolution of Budo hasn't made missteps or that the ideologies within the space don't have flaws. They certainly do. What I'm doing here is saying that English-speaking pop culture is almost certainly wrong about Budo evolution. The West has a pretty big role in its development, and there is more to training martial arts than fighting. Speaking personally, I value a certain degree of martial functionality, but at this point in my life, I think it's maybe my third or fourth priority when it comes to choosing a martial art. I will get into all of that more in the companion video coming out alongside this one. But for now, let's wrap up this video. Alright, this is the nerdy source section of the video, which is for nerds. If you couldn't care less about my sources, you can feel free to head out, go check out that companion video if you would. For everyone still here, I'd start with Dr. Carl Friday's Off the Warpath, a long-time staple of the channel. I'd then move to his article Bushido or Bull. A nice complement to this piece can be found on the koryu.com website and is called The Historical Foundations of Budo. Keeping with Friday, I'd finally read his book Legacies of the Sword. He says some things that feel contradictory to his points in Off the Warpath in this book, but keep in mind that Legacies was written 7-ish years prior. We can safely assume his understanding of the origins of martial arts schools developed through his research during that time. Setting Friday aside, I'd look at Lance Gatling's piece, The Historical Background and Philosophic Basis of Kano Jigoro's Judo Principles, Seiryoku Zenyo Jita Kyoe. A good accompanying work to this is Herbert Spencer's Education, Intellectual, Moral, and Physical. It isn't as required as some of the previous pieces, but I think Peter Cave's Bukatsudo, The Educational Role of Japanese School Clubs, is another good piece to take a peek at. I'd say that these are the principal sources of this video, but I'm going to take the time here to list some extra stuff that I would consider pretty crucial context. First, Don Drager's classical Budo, which seems to be the origin of the whole Bujutsu and Budo divide thesis. The aforementioned Invented Traditions, edited by Vlastos, is a good read as well. Don Cunningham's Taiho Jutsu, Law and Order in the Age of Samurai, combined with Punishment and Power in the Making of Modern Japan by Daniel V. Botsman, will give you a good overview of the legal situation in early modern Japan, as well as the criminal situation. Miyamoto Musashi, His Life and Writings by Kenji Tokitsu, is a decent book on Musashi and dueling more broadly. Martial Arts and the Body Politic in Meiji Japan by Dennis Gainley is probably one of two dense readings here, but it will give you a political history of martial arts in the Meiji period. The other tough read would be The Culture of Secrecy in Japanese Religion, edited by Bernard Sneed and Mark Twain. Although obviously not a martial arts book, it describes the importance of secrets in the economy of Edo Japan very well, and this is related to martial arts. There is also a 1984 piece, so a little dated but still useful, I think, called post-war martial arts programs in Japanese higher education, case of Nippon College of Physical Education. Outside of this, I would always recommend that anyone read Japanese survey histories. These are a dime a dozen, but I started with David Liu's 2-volume set called A Documentary History of Japan back in my undergraduate years, and these can be combined with really any other survey of Japanese history as well. Of course, survey histories tend to be more like popular history and have some errors, but if you aren't looking to be an expert and just want to get some general ideas and context, these are great speed runs. Finally, I'd always suggest the rest of Dr. Friday's backlog to people who are samurai and martial arts enthusiasts. Hired swords and samurai warfare in the state in early medieval Japan are great starting points. Aside from that, I'd strongly suggest looking at my reading list video. I have a small library in storage and was at one point reading like 3 or 4 books a week during my graduate school days. Although I can definitely point to books that have shaped my views more than others, it would also be a mistake for me to say the process of extensive reading hasn't compounded on me. I can't recommend enough that you read everything you can get your hands on, even if it's only tangentially related to whatever martial art you practice. A good example of this might be religious studies. It can't be understated how much Confucian, Buddhist, and Taoist and Shinto practices have on the way that Japanese people think, and therefore how they reflect on martial arts. All right, I think that's everything. Like I said, so much stuff was cut from this video. I had one version with a much more in-depth comparison with American martial art culture, a version that was like 10 minutes extra just because I was establishing the Meiji period as a setting. I liked all that stuff, but it felt like fluff when I really just wanted to push the central point that I outlined here in this video. Basically, my script went from like 50 or 60 pages down to 20. Remember, I have a companion video to this one. It should be on screen now if you want to check it out. If you want to hear how all this has affected me and my training alongside a bit of real-life context, definitely go there. Really do think it's meaningful to see how all the history and philosophy and stats actually translate into tangible reality. If there is a weakness to academic type history, it's that it does a very poor job tying the past and abstract information into everyday life. Hopefully the tie-in video helps bridge that gap even just a little. As ever, thank you all for listening. I appreciate you all very, very much. There really is not a Tengu channel without you. And I will catch you all in the next one very, very soon. Peace.